Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, it's your boy, Ronald, with Learn one more time, doing something a little bit different today. So we're going to do a little bit of an analysis of the concept of the Electoral College, seen through the eyes of this particular David Rubin interview. This is him with the lawyer Tara Ross. Now, as Dave Rubin kind of brings up in the beginning of this video, Tara Ross kind of became a little bit more famous around the time of the filming because she did a particular PragerU video. Now, PragerU is a wellspring of misinformation and delightful little things that are easy to misinterpret. Tara Ross's PragerU video is no exception there. So we're going to go through this. I was considering showing you the full 5-minute PragerU video, but honestly, she goes through most of the important concepts in this video. So we're just going to run through this, and really everything else applies back to her original video. So she's going to focus really heavily on the Electoral College. Dave Rubin is mostly going to do his Dave Rubin thing and just kind of let her say whatever the heck she wants without too much challenge. Although there are a few instances where that's not quite the case. So we'll go through all of that. The corruption in politics video is definitely coming. Give me a moment. It's taking a lot longer than I thought it would. It's a lot because it's not my field of expertise, and I'd like to know a bit more before I actually get into it. So without any further ado, let's get back to Dave Rubin and Tara Ross.
In the wake of the election outcome in 2016, and that was readily available, and I'm so happy that Prager did that.
Yeah, and as we now ramp into this 2020 election, this conversation about should we have an electoral college, why do we have it, should it be popular vote, this whole thing keeps ramping up more and more. So we're going to spend most of our conversation talking about that, but I thought we'd just start generally talking about the Constitution and some of the laws that govern us these days, because people seem very confused about them. Tell me a little bit about something that we don't know about the Constitution that we should know.
The first thing that leapt to my mind was people think that the federal government has any power except things that are expressly prohibited. And it's actually the other way around. The federal government only has the power that the Constitution expressly gives to it. Mm-hmm. Everything else is reserved to the states or the people. And if you think about that, that's a really important distinction. The federal government can only do what the Constitution explicitly says, yes, you may do this. And the federal government has grown so out of bounds that it's doing the opposite. Every day it does the opposite.
Yeah, well, it seems that that's how we're governed now, that almost everything is through the federal government, and especially if you listen to the Democratic candidates now, that they seem to want to do all of these things regardless of what states want and things like that. How do they get away with it? I don't mean to make this even partisan, in general speaking.
I would say both parties do it. I think it starts with us, honestly, because think about anything that's happening. If a natural disaster hits, tornado in Dallas, people, hopefully in Texas a little bit less as a Texas girl, but we look to the government, and we don't look even to the state government, we look to the federal government. We want our governor to declare a state emergency because then we know there's more federal funds, there's more this, there's more that. I think the mindsets of everybody has changed so badly that we're enabling the situation to continue. So maybe we can start at home by, look, I'm from Dallas. I hope we're pitching in, we're helping our neighbors, we're hopefully looking to our state or our city before we.
So she makes a decent point here. The federal overreach doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen without, some consent from a lot of different parties. Part of that is the people. Part of that is the government itself. We do get conditioned to rely on a lot of federal sources in times where we have trouble, partly because at that point, usually the federal government has already reached out and tried to give us extra resources. Occasionally, that is just a matter of the federal government just deciding to do something. Like, for instance, if we go way back a little bit, when the Louisiana Purchase was done, he knew that was, they knew that was illegal. They expressly knew it and did it anyway because it was too good of an offer to pass up. Similarly, some of the efforts that were made in the early United States to try and stabilize the economy and get a source of national credit in the form of the first bank of the United States was kind of questionably constitutional. In fact, some of those powers were explicitly denied to Congress, and however they went ahead and did it anyway, because there was a perceived need. And one common theme that we're going to see in the corruption video is that oftentimes when there are, larger expansions of federal power, there is a perceived need, whether that be like a wartime emergency or an economic emergency. Usually that's what triggers a lot of these expansions that she's talking about. This is a real problem. It's a very complicated one to go through. So there's that. So we'll discuss that more in our other corruption videos. Good point there from her.
The federal government, I think that if we can work on that, that's a really big problem I just outlined.
Yeah.
But
well, are you shocked at sort of how little it seems people know or care about our founding documents? I mean, I talk about them here all the time. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are sitting on the wall in my control room right over there. But that so few people actually really think about the documents that led to the unprecedented freedom that we're living in right now.
We live in a world that has created that. We have schools that teach social studies when they used to teach history.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's where she starts to get a little weird. So social studies instead of history? I mean, so my sister is in school still right now. So I asked her, did they stop teaching history? Are they only teaching social studies? Because I know when I was, younger, they taught me both. Why would they switch one out for the other? Yeah, no, that's not how it works. They still teach both. I don't know where she's getting this from.
Mm-hmm. When, we don't teach the Federalist Papers, which of course were and the Anti-Federalist Papers, which were the arguments back and forth at the time of the founding about the Constitution and why it exists as it does and what they were trying to create. We don't do any of this stuff in our schools anymore. And then we have adults that grow up having never been exposed to this, and so nobody knows. Literally nobody knows. And I think the founding generation, if you read in the Federalist Papers, especially over and over and over again, James Madison or Alexander Hamilton will say, the people will keep this in line. Mm-hmm. They talk about the people as if we will be educated, as if we will know, as if we will take all of this into consideration when we're voting and doing all the things that we do. But once you undermine education and once that's gone, how can you possibly keep this structure in place anymore?
Do you think that was a miscalculation by the founders, that over time sort of that the state would kind of slowly grow, and then as it grew that education would kind of get worse, and maybe they couldn't envision all of that, but that was their miscalculation, that the people would somehow always be engaged?
Yes. They assumed the people would be engaged. You read it over and over again. They also assumed we would always be more loyal to our states than to the federal government, which probably, by the way, comes with the education.
So next comes a somewhat long-ish segment about states' rights and how the federal and state government serves as checks and balances to each other. Some of that's relevant to this video, some of it's not. But let's skip some of that and go to a delightfully relevant little tidbit that Dave Rubin likes to point out right here.
Like, well, now if the government does some bad stuff, it's not that you can leave your state, because the next state's going to be the same. You got to leave the country.
Right. That's not good.
That's not good.
So a lot of the next part is not particularly relevant to what we're talking about regarding the Electoral College. They talk a little bit more about states' rights and, what kind of their benefits of small government versus big government, and kind of how she prefers less regulation, yada, yada, yada. Good conversations, topics, but not really the subject of this video. But, well, before we actually get to the meat and potatoes of what they talk about regarding the Electoral College, there's just one more part that I wanted to kind of get into briefly before we really dig right into the Electoral College stuff. And that kind of starts with Dave Rubin going something like this.
Agree with me that free speech really is in a tenuous state that maybe it hasn't been, say, the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I do. I think we kind of went from a place where there were a whole bunch of things that we were trying to become more tolerant of, and then we got to the place where we were more tolerant of a whole bunch of stuff. And now we're at a place where on the other side, where now you're no longer to even say things that were the norm 20 or 30 years ago. It's like it flipped on it. It's very weird to me. And there's certain things that I think you can't say without all sorts of bad things coming down on your head.
If you had to sort of grade...
So this is one of the first things that kind of tipped me off that this lady might be missing some things. Think about what she says here just now, right? So we started tolerating some stuff and we made some efforts and that was nice. Then we became really tolerant. And then we went all the way across where all of a sudden this tolerance led to a potential change in my behavior. I have to say things or not say things that you previously couldn't say. Well, then what was the point of all this change if I actually had to change my behavior? She seems to have missed the entire point of just societal self-reflection and trying to better ourselves. I mean, that's the point. Eventually, you have to change. And she points out that, oh, you could say these things 20, 30 years ago. Yeah, that's the point, right? We made progress quickly. Isn't that something to celebrate, not something to be baffled over? I mean, this is a good thing. Seriously. I mean, this whole issue of free speech here is really something. You know, you already weren't free to libel or to slander, or hate speech. There were already clear limits on your free speech. And we live in an era where corporations are now allowed to speak freely and generate protected political speech. They really like to be selective on this show on what exactly they mean when they say, oh, free speech is under attack. It's in attack in some places where probably it should be under attack, right? There are already reasonable limits to our free speech. Setting further reasonable limits is potentially reasonable. Now, once again, they've not given any specific examples of where they think this is happening, which is not to say where there aren't, places where they do specifically state this happening. It's just not in this particular interview. So I won't go into detail on that, but the very fundamental thought here that change is too much when it starts to encroach onto our lives, and when we have to speak a little different, that's too much. That's the point of change. That's literally the point. And as we're going to see here, there's a couple times where she's missing the point, but I would almost think that that's by intention, as we're going to see in a minute. So let's get through to the Electoral College stuff.
Sort of grade the way the system's kind of functioning right now.
Oh, we're broken. We're broken. I've been saying that for a while, and we're broken. I do think we're talking about the Electoral College a little bit. I think that is one thing that will help. I do think we've been broken before, and we've come out of it. We were broken in the years after the Civil War. It was a big mess then. Mm-hmm. We had multiple elections where, the electoral vote and the popular vote did not match up. Mm-hmm. And there were 2 elections where the recorded national popular vote winner did not win the election. There was year after year where the electoral map looked really, really similar, very closely divided. The red areas always seem to be red and the blue areas always seem to be blue, which is what we're doing now. And
so the second time I came back and watched this video, I was almost blown away by this particular bit. Just the remarkable lack of self-awareness here is it's just really impressive, honestly. So she kind of just made a lot of solid arguments for why the Electoral College is bullshit. If you observe what she's saying here, right? So she notes the discrepancy between the national popular vote and the Electoral College vote, with a bit of reservation. It seems like that by itself is not something she approves of inherently. And on top of that, she kind of goes to point out that a lot of these states don't switch too much. And this plays into some of her kind of rebuttals later on. Their rebuttals are really flimsy. These particular arguments are actually a lot of my main arguments. We'll see how that plays out here, but this is just the beginning of a long pattern that we're going to see throughout this video, where Tara Ross does not have a lot of self-awareness. She doesn't seem to be listening to what she says as she's saying it. So this is going to be really fun. You're going to see a little bit more of these mental gymnastics immediately after I stop talking. Once again, par for the course. You got to really have some serious mental gymnastic skills to believe some of the things that some of these conservatives on like the Rubin Report and PragerU believe. And I assure you, we will be doing more of this in the future. This is kind of a fun video to make, honestly.
Eventually, because of the Electoral College, we came out of that, is my belief, because if you think about it, if you're a Democrat in the South in those years, you cannot win the White House at all, period, because you don't have enough electoral votes in your safe areas. But if you are a Republican, you kind of have the opposite problem, where you have enough in the North, Northwest, which is where it generally was, to win, but kind of just barely. And if the Democrats make any inroads at all, you're going to lose. So both sides over time had to reach out to the other side and listen and figure it out. And so that's why I think we're there now. I do think that's what's happening. But I also have hope that because of the structure of the system, even though we're not educated enough about it, that we will come back to a better place where we just have to figure it out.
All right. So
I think that's yet another rather telling feature of this interview. We have to get to a place where we just got to figure it out. She's not claiming to have any of these answers. She just says, we got this electoral college. We just got to figure out how to make it work with the electoral college. She doesn't really have a good answer as to how we're going to make it work retaining the electoral college. She's just rather determined to retain the electoral college. A conclusion without much of a solution proposed to it. It's not very useful. And on top of that, there's a pretty obvious solution. Get rid of the electoral college. So we'll delve into that now. There's a whole next part that's coming up. We're going to fast forward through most of that. It's about the electoral college for the Senate, which is potentially actually a good idea, honestly. She goes through it. Having an electoral college for the Senate, as at least for the original thinking, kind of makes sense just because the Senate was supposed to represent the state's interest directly, as opposed to the people's interest in Congress. And from that perspective, getting rid of the state election for the Senate in terms of an electoral college versus the popular vote the way we do it now, which dates back to, as she points out here correctly, the 17th Amendment. That actually kind of gets rid of the bicameralism of the Congress, right? Because the upper house, the Senate, is supposed to represent state interests, and they're supposed to kind of be voted in separately in a different way. That way you have the state's interests and the people's interests both kind of represented somewhat separately in Congress. And that was the way it was supposed to be, which is an interesting discussion, but not super relevant to the issue of an electoral college for the president on a national level, because the president is not really an express representative of the state or any given state. He's supposed to be a representative of all the states. So it doesn't really make sense to, that same argument doesn't really apply directly to the issue of an electoral college for the president.
Idea of the Electoral College first come from?
Well, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention spent the whole summer going back and forth. Should we have a national popular vote, just like people want now? Mm-hmm. Should we do something else? They had crazy ideas. Maybe we'll have 3 presidents. Maybe we'll have. They talk about legislative selection. That was one of the main ideas on the table. Maybe we'll have Congress select the president. They talked about governors selecting the president. They had a whole bunch of ideas. But the 2 ideas that were there at the end, the primary ones, were national popular vote and Congress picks the president. Nobody knows exactly what happened because there was a committee for unfinished business and they went behind closed doors. And there was
things haven't changed that much.
Right. And so there was one report that James Madison took a pen and paper and sketched out the idea. They came back and presented to the whole convention. The convention was surprised that they had deviated from national popular vote. But this is what they had decided on. And it solve the concerns of the big versus small states that have been going back and forth the whole summer. Mm-hmm. The big states, by and large, were more comfortable with national popular vote idea. Mm-hmm. The small states were really uncomfortable. They thought they would be tyrannized. And there's a great quote from a Delaware delegate, and he says, "I do not trust you, gentlemen. If you have the power," he says gentlemen, which I think is funny. "I do not trust you." He's like underlined in italics,
Right.
Gentlemen, if you have the power, the abuse of it could not be checked, and you would exercise it to our destruction. And that's what the small states felt, that we will be destroyed if you have this kind of a system in place. And I think it's important to note, by the way, that the divide here was not slave versus not slave. It was small versus large. Mm-hmm. And there were some large states that had, more slaves than not, and vice versa. And the same thing with the small states. Some had slaves, some didn't. It was not a slave versus not slave divide. It was a small versus large.
So here's the first kind of bullshit moment of this entire interview here, as far as regarding the Electoral College anyway. So she kind of goes into this rather classical argument of, it wasn't big states versus small states, it wasn't slave-owning states versus non-slave-owning states. It was big states versus small states. And she gives an anecdote here that I think is rather interesting. So this is kind of the story that's repeated about the conventional college, that there has been like she said, a disagreement all summer regarding, how are we going to represent ourselves when choosing the president of the United States, right? And right off the bat, this kind of is an interesting little issue, right? Because the answer seems obvious. How are we going to be represented? Well, one man, one vote, of course, right? Isn't that the fairest system by far, just immediately? You don't even have to think too much about it. So then why wasn't that the obvious answer? Why was representation not a clear-cut thing? Can you think of anything that might make it a little difficult to judge? Yeah, that's right, slavery. Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. And so let's go a little deeper into that particular answer. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring up one point that I think is actually a little stronger than the points that she's bringing up regarding the state's electoral representation. And that is the objection regarding education of the populace about their representative, right? So back in 1786, when the Constitutional Convention was actually happening, this was actually a legitimate issue. The people really didn't have a great way of becoming well informed about the candidates that they were voting on. And that was true in 1786, but I would point out that by around 1800, 1801, that particular election, we started to see the development of kind of early political national parties that themselves were large organizations that were able to disseminate information regarding the candidates. And therefore, this issue by around then was really beginning to be remedied, which we'll come back to in just a second. So that kind of is a stronger reason to potentially do something like an electoral college initially in 1786. But as we'll see later with the 12th Amendment, that should not still be the case. So we go back to 1786, the Constitutional Convention. Why was one man, one vote not the obvious answer? And so James Madison himself, the future fourth president of the United States, puts it rather well when he says, the right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern states than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes. In other words, a direct election would disadvantage the slaveholding southern states, who had more than 500,000 slaves, which by that system they would not be able to vote. Right? And so the whole point of making an electoral college instead of the national popular vote was so that you could count black people as 3/5 of people. Madison came out of that behind closed doors scenario with a compromise that surprised everybody, because it was pretty friggin' shady. Think about that. Madison is a guy from Virginia. He is a slaveholding state senator who is coming out with a proposal to essentially take away some of the power of the northern states and give power to the southern states in a big way, by the way. So those initial electoral college, that was 91 votes. Virginia got over a quarter of those 91 votes, right? So that's really, so sorry, not a quarter of the 91, but a quarter of the 46 needed to win, which made Virginia immediately one of the most important states with regard to the electoral college. Whereas Pennsylvania, who had 10% more free people in it than Virginia, got 20% fewer electoral votes. And really perversely, what this leads to is that slaveholding southern states were able to get more electoral college representation by simply buying or breeding more slaves, which is really fucked up. That is really the point of that system. That is why there was any point of contention between so-called big and small states. And she, of course, undermines her own argument in her response here, right? So she points out, not all big states were really, having a problem not all big states were really into the national popular vote, and not all small states were against it. Why was that? Maybe it was because some of them were in the north and some of them were in the south. Once again, fairly obvious answers to a lot of the questions that she asks if you look for it for a second. The reason I mentioned the other thing earlier about the information and how that had changed by 1800 was because we had a chance to change this in 1803 when they debated the 12th Amendment. So the 12th Amendment made a bit of a change to the Electoral College. So instead of making it so that there was the original system of choose whoever you think is best for the role of president, and then whoever comes in second place becomes the vice president, which, by the way, was the way that they used to do it. And kind of the thinking behind that was that that second place runner-up might have different political views than yours. And so you kind of had to, promote yourself a little bit more and not be as negative as on other candidates, just because one of them might be your vice president at the end of all this, which was actually a decent system. And really, what ended up happening with the 12th Amendment, which allowed electors to cast separate votes for the president and the vice president, so that there could be a potential joined ticket of president, vice president, the way we have it today, did allow for a bit more populist candidates to rise, because really you were able to appeal more to your base, right? Because you don't have to worry about your vice president becoming, somebody who opposes you, somebody who does not agree with your ideas. You can just bring along whoever you want, and this kind of eliminates one of the barriers towards populism coming to power. Why do I bring that up now? Well, this is an amendment that changed the Electoral College, and it reconsidered it after that initial objection of not being informed enough, that the citizenry wasn't informed enough, when that was less of an issue. And so this was a time when they really could have reformed the Electoral College. They could have dumped it entirely. Instead, they chose to keep it, right? And this was actually something that was discussed. It's not like this is just something I made up that I think they should have talked about that they didn't. They themselves were talking about this. The Massachusetts Congressman Samuel Thatcher actually complained specifically that slaves add 13 members to the House and 18 electors of president and vice president at the next election. And he just was essentially ignored. This problem was recognized before. Slavery was the central issue when it comes to the Electoral College. And it was simply that the northern states repeatedly caved to the southern states to try and essentially maintain the peace. It was an issue about slavery. Big and small were just little surrogate, little word games that people like to play so that they don't have to come to grips with that fact. That's just the case. It was stated outright by James Madison himself. I mean, come on.
Reps, say, from big states that actually were for the Electoral College? Because that would have been giving power away, but we do know that a lot of the founders were trying to curtail that power.
So James Madison's from Virginia, and I think he was more comfortable in the beginning with just a national popular vote, but he felt like this was a better compromise in the end. Obviously, he sketched it out behind closed doors.
Right now, when people say, and we're hearing this more and more, we should just have the popular vote, that, the current president lost the popular vote, he's an illegitimate president. What is the counter argument?
I really wish people would stop and just think about why the Democratic Party lost. The people who are upset on the Democratic side because they lost, they've spent a lot of time blasting the system and criticizing the system, criticizing Trump. And I wish they would spend more time thinking about why they lost. And the reason they lost is because Hillary Clinton spent too much time doing exactly what the Electoral College does not want her to do, or any candidate to do, which is she focused too exclusively on one kind of voter. It's kind of voter that happens to live in big cities, in New York and California, mostly. She got 20% of her vote from only New York and California, and most of her vote in those two states came from the big cities. Towards the end of the campaign, people don't usually know this, but she thought she was about to win the electoral vote and lose the popular vote. So she actually doubled down on that strategy, and she started spending a lot of time and resources on safe areas that she was already expecting to do well, because she wanted to drive up the popular vote in those safe areas so that she would not have that discrepancy between the electoral and the popular vote. But of course, if she'd instead gone to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, spread out her base of appeal, built coalitions, worked on that, she probably would have won. It was within reach, and she could have done it, but she didn't.
So is the main argument then that basically you will create a situation where a state like California, which has what, like the 10th biggest economy in the world or something like that, this huge population, it's a huge landmass, and then New York with a huge, huge population concentrated in big cities, that if we get rid of the Electoral College, that almost everything, but especially the middle of the country, will just be completely ignored by the federal government. So it's the same issue from 200 years ago, right?
Right. I mean, if you're a candidate, you have limited time, you have limited resources. That's just human. That's not good or bad. It's just what it is. And you physically cannot go everywhere. You cannot, it's not productive or efficient to try to strategize how to bring in people from different parts of the country. What is most productive as a purely strategic matter is just to go to where people already like you and just start drumming up support. I mean, if you're a Republican, maybe you go to Houston and you look at the oil interest and you say, I'll give you this, I'll give you that, I'll give you this. And you just try to drum up as many people as you can. If you're a Democrat, maybe you say, I'm going to give the environmental lobby everything they want. I'm going to go to LA and San Francisco. I'm going to start drumming up support there. I'll ban plastic straws in the whole country or something. I don't know. So it is just practical. It's not even malevolent or anything at all. It is just what it is. It is a huge, big, diverse country. And if you don't give candidates a reason to care, they're not going to.
What would you say to the people that would just say, tough, that we should do this by how many people vote for somebody? And you know what? If you live in Missouri in a small town, that's tough. You don't live in a big city, but the big city person's vote doesn't count less than yours.
You know, it's so interesting to me that people think that, because there is not any other context where we would just say tough. You know, we wouldn't say if one race can outvote the other race, tough. You know, we can do whatever we want. No, nobody would say that. We shouldn't say that. So why is it okay to say, yeah, if the big city people outvote the farmers, who cares? I don't think that's right. I think what's right is to create a society that is just, and to do our best to take into account a wide variety of needs. And
so here's our second bullshit moment of the video, and this argument kind of builds on the previous argument about how small states are potentially the ones that are benefiting from the Electoral College, and therefore we should keep it. Now, what she says here is essentially that, well, if you let it be popular vote, it doesn't make sense to go where you don't already have a bunch of the vote. You just go to the big cities where you have a vote, you drum up support there. And it's really interesting because if you're paying any attention, the system she's describing as what would happen potentially without the Electoral College is literally the system that we have right now, which is really amazing. So we can just use the 2016 election as an example of this, all right? So the candidates spent almost all their time in just a handful of states, and pretty much all of these were medium or large-sized states. And in fact, 2/3 of all campaign events happened in just 6 states: Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, and Michigan. And if you just go to, a couple more states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Colorado, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Arizona, those 12 states together account for 96% of campaign events that year. 12 states. And guess what? The 9 smallest states, including DC, got 0 campaign events. 0. The 10th largest was the only one out of the small states that got any events at all. That's New Hampshire, by the way. So in total, 25 states, mostly small and medium-sized, got no campaign attention whatsoever. And yeah, sure, most of the ones that got attention were on the big side, but the ones that she particularly talks about, New York, California, Texas, they got virtually no campaign attention whatsoever. And remember, Texas is typically thought of as a red state. So that didn't really even benefit the biggest states, actually. So obviously there's a reason for this, right? And so it's pretty much entirely partisan, right? The reason that they've kept with this system is that Republicans really think that they have the votes in the Electoral College, where they're pretty much good and they have a good way of a good path to power. A clear path to power is the phrase that they keep using around the electoral cycle. But as long as they maintain that electoral college, it kind of gives them that advantage. Otherwise, as we'll see a little bit later, they are not going to do so well if they go to pure popular vote. But the real point here is that what she's saying, as far as the small states being disadvantaged if you take away the electoral college, is patently nonsense. It is patently nonsense. We can see, just by looking at our system right now, that the small states, if this is what they're benefiting, like it's not much of a benefit. They're being completely ignored by presidential candidates. And may I remind you that this is a system where we have the electoral college. We don't need to speculate about what's going to happen with the electoral college. We know what's going to happen. We need to stop using these theories about, oh, it should protect the small states. No, just look at what's happening. The small states are not being protected. Small states are being largely ignored. The next part of this argument that she's going to be talking about later is the idea of swing states and how we kind of explained this idea that only 12 states account for 96% of the campaign's attention. She kind of started laying the groundwork for what's going on there herself just a minute ago, but she somehow tried to use it to argue it completely the opposite point. And if you're paying attention, you see how little sense this makes. The small states are very much being ignored. So let's see what she's got to say.
And if you think about it, I mean, if you let the big cities dictate to the farmers, where they do most of the producing in this country, by the way, you're telling the people who are the end users that they can tyrannize over the producers. That's going to create a really bad situation.
We see this in California all the time. If you drive up the coast where all the farmers are complaining about water rights and then the big cities are getting all the water, and it's like, guys, they're the ones growing the food.
Right.
Does anyone care about the food?
Right. And so you have these dynamics in the states. It's in New York too. It's in a couple of other states, and it's in Texas, really. Why do we think that we can change the system and that these problems that already exist at the state level will not happen at the national level? Of course they will.
So here again, we see a somewhat similar argument to what's being stated before, as far as the small states being disadvantaged in the absence of an electoral college. She kind of expands this argument a little bit towards rural voters. And similar logic applies to both the defense of this argument and the other argument, namely that it doesn't work the way she's saying. You know what I mean? So the Electoral College still works to minimize these people's votes. It still works exactly the same way. It doesn't protect small states, and it doesn't protect rural voters because, once again, in the states where these voters are a minority, like, for instance, California, which is the example she gives, note that they're already being ignored. Their voice already means nothing, as she's pointed out. Now, she blames the state. Next things that she states is actually that she thinks that there should be an electoral college system that's related to the governors and state legislature and stuff like that. I don't necessarily disagree with her there, but once again, we're talking about the national, the national popular vote, selecting the president. And she makes this argument that, hey, it's not working at the state level, so what makes you think it'll work at the national level? Once again, on the surface, this sounds like it kind of makes sense. It sounds like it should work that way. But once again, remember the argument we just made, that this actually gives politicians license to ignore large swaths of the country. And as she pointed out previously, it's impractical to go to all the little places in the country that are like rural and stuff like that. You go to cities. The Electoral College just compounds these things, and it makes it even worse for rural voters. Note that there are no campaign rallies, zero, in 2016 or in 2019, or sorry, in 2020, that are in these rural areas, except for Erie, right? Pennsylvania. Trump did that because he thought he was losing. He wanted to shore up some support. These are desperation moves, if these rural voters are counted at all, directly anyway, by candidates' campaign efforts. This is the system we have. Remember, we are talking on the federal level. It doesn't quite carry over apples to apples the way she's talking. And I think she, on some level, if she thought about it, would recognize this, to be completely honest, because that argument only sounds like it works. And there's even more of a problem with this. outside of simply the structure and the way the Electoral College already has encouraged candidates to ignore small states and rural areas. And that's simply the matter that, if you add up the populations of the 10 largest cities in the United States, you only end up with 25.4 million people by the 2019 census estimates. By those same estimates, the U.S. population is at this point about 328.2 million. What does that come out to? Well, that's about 7.7% of the population living in the largest cities. And of course, that's the 10 largest cities. But if you go any lower than the 10 largest cities, all of those cities have sub-million populations, right? That's when you start getting into populations less than 1 million. And given that the total population is 328 million versus that 25.4, it's still a small minority of the country that are directly living in cities. So you literally cannot win only catering to the cities. You won't win by a national popular vote. That is already mathematically impossible. It is a relatively small part of the country that you would be speaking directly to if you're in a national popular vote. The Electoral College, doesn't really fix this. It really doesn't fix this. And we'll go into this even more detail in a hot second. So really this argument is kind of an extension of her previous one, and it's rebutted for a lot of the same reasons and some more problems that are just mathematically intractable.
So I have actually long said, I think California, Texas, a handful of the big states, for their governor, should have an electoral college kind of thing going on. I think it would produce better governance in the big states.
Interesting. So you would take an electoral college concept and apply it even to those big states, because that way you could sort of control their need to just serve the big, Dallas and
Why
say
should farmers in
Los
California
Angeles,
be tyrannized by the people in the big cities? Why should people in the middle of Texas, where there's, very small population cities, why should they be tyrannized by, I live in Dallas, but why should they be tyrannized by us in Dallas or in Houston or in San Antonio or Austin? They have different needs and concerns. And I'm not sure the gubernatorial processes always reflect that.
So I know that we don't know everything that went on in these meetings where James Madison's sketching this all out, but where did all the numbers come from?
Well, the numbers come from Congress. So you have the same number of electors as you do members of the House plus your 2 senators. So that is true for every single state. That's how I'm from Texas. We have 38 electors. We have 36 congressmen plus 2 senators.
So these can change over time, right?
They do change over time.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how does that affect the way everybody's drawing up demographic maps and all kinds of stuff?
Well, it's really just based on the census. And so it's based on, after the census, they decide how many people are going to be in the House, and then we reallocate the electors just to match it.
So that was a decent introduction to how allocation and the basics of the Electoral College work in that sense. Let's add a few more details, because in this case, I think the devil is very much in the details. So she alluded to some basic facts there. The number of senators and House representatives determines how many representatives how many Electoral College votes a given state has. And given that, the minimum number of senators is 2 and the minimum number of representatives is 1, the minimum number of Electoral College votes that any state can have is therefore 3. Some of the smallest states have exactly 3 Electoral College votes, and that's actually the minimum. And in fact, in the amendment, or the law, I believe in 1969, when we included Washington, D.C. in the Electoral College, we gave them that minimum, despite them not really even, they wouldn't even have a representative or a senator. They really don't qualify for any of that. And at first, they really didn't have any electoral votes. Now we gave them 3. That's called the Wyoming rule. Now, there are some other implications for how exactly this works, because at this point, the number of Electoral College representatives is essentially capped by law at its current level. And so we can use this to kind of determine how much your vote counts, essentially, state by state. And really, this does vary rather dramatically. So, for instance, in California, there's about 1 elector for every 285,000 registered voters. And in Wyoming, there's about 89,000 registered voters to every 1 electoral vote. So just based on that, if you live in Wyoming, just by dint of living in Wyoming, your vote is worth more than 3 times that much as far as the Electoral College is concerned versus somebody in California. Now, what makes that particular deficiency even more remarkable is that if you were to look at proportionate representation, just looking at the population, California should have 10 more votes in the Electoral College than they actually do. So really, oftentimes when people are arguing this, they think California is overrepresented. It's actually pretty underrepresented just given its population. In fact, a little bit more detail, votes in the Electoral College are allocated per state law as far as like who those votes go to, which candidate. And except for Maine and Nebraska, those states typically adopt an all or nothing policy where if you win by even 1%, you get all the votes. Even if there's 49% of people who vote against you, their votes essentially just don't matter. You get all of the Electoral College votes in that state. Now, if you take once again the example of California that people love using, more people in California voted for Trump by the numbers than in any other state, save Florida and Texas. But their votes didn't count for any electoral votes because they were the minority. Now, this once again exacerbates that problem that we had talked about earlier. And a great example here is that if you look at the campaign money on the campaign trail, how much focus did people give to certain states? And really, they focused more than half of their money, more than half of all their campaign spending in the last election, 2016, on just 4 states: Ohio, Florida, Vermont, and Pennsylvania. Why? Because those are the primary swing states that actually matter, that give you the most number of votes that you actually have a chance of getting, right? So Florida went Republican in the 2016 election. Because it was a swing state during that election. And so they focused on it. Each candidate visited Florida over 30 times. And yet only about, I believe it was about 18 of the states in total got any campaign attention from either of the candidates. Everybody else was simply left out. So this is the system as it is with the Electoral College. It doesn't seem particularly sensible. Furthermore, if you move within the United States to a territory of the United States, you essentially lose your right to vote. Now think about that. People in the territories do not get any Electoral College votes. They don't get a vote. They don't count. But they are technically U.S. citizens, and they technically have to pay taxes. But they don't get any say in what the hell happens to them, which is remarkable. Even more remarkable, given the fact that you can actually vote from space, right? If you go to space in the International Space Station, you get to vote. If you move to another country, you can send your ballot to the last state you resided in. But if you go to Guam or something, you just don't get to vote as long as you live there. It's really something.
So do you feel that the system is actually functioning as it should then? Even if the people aren't being as responsible and maybe don't know civics the way you would want them to and all of those things, do you think that the basic election system, and especially, again, because we're rolling into an election, we're going to hear about election rigging, we're going to hear about foreign influence, we're going to hear about popular vote versus Electoral College, but do you think that the elections are basically safe and secure and that this is sort of the best way that they can operate?
Yeah. I do. Look, I think we're a mess right now. I think both parties are being really super stubborn about fixing themselves. I think pretty much everybody could do a better job of working to build coalitions and of being inclusive and trying to understand the people that don't fall in line exactly, where I am. And until we figure that out, it's going to look like this. I hope we figure it out soon because I'm kind of tired of it, as everybody else is. But the system is not working. And the reason we're having close elections is because everybody's being stubborn, which is, like I said, what happened after the Civil War. Is
the irony here, though, that if the states would actually take back some of the rights that they've been sort of outsourcing to the federal government, that none of this would matter that much, right? Because the presidency would have less power.
Right.
So that really is that to me strikes me as the answer, right? Like you keep as much as you can local, and then it won't matter that much what the executive branch can do.
And if the states were back in charge, then there would be less for the judges to do, which means the judicial nominations would be less of a, less of an influence. I think people are just so worried that their preferred policy preference on whatever it is going to get decided by judicial nominations or by the president or by, and so it becomes so important. And it's the system that was created by the founders is very decentralized. There should never be that much power in one place. There shouldn't be that much power in the Supreme Court or the presidency. It should be spread out. And if it were, yeah, exactly. What would there be to be? Why would I be mad about anything? Why would a Texan care what a Californian decided about straws? It wouldn't matter. Who cares? It doesn't matter.
As it shouldn't matter.
As it shouldn't. Exactly.
Yeah. What do you make of the executive action portion of this? What do you think the founders would be saying about the way we govern? Where, and again, everybody does it. So this is not a partisan thing.
Both sides do it.
GWB did it too, and then Obama reversed a lot of it, and now Trump reversed a lot of that. I mean, that's a really dangerous way to govern. Meaning, because what she's saying is, I will take whatever power I can to literally take away one of the second Bill of Rights.
I think it goes back to not knowing history. Founders, when they created our Constitution, it was one of the most important things to them. They felt like our liberty is protected when we can protect ourselves. And it's not only about hunting, it's about protecting your liberty. And, people like to laugh at that, I guess, and say, well, our arms don't match the armies. And I guess that's true. But at the time of the founding, Amendment.
All right, so another thing that people always talk about with elections is that now we're in a position where we know that certain states are basically always going to be blue. We're in one right now. States are pretty much close to always being red. You live in one in Texas, although that one's even getting a little iffy these days. But that now we're putting so much pressure on these few swing states. So Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, things like that. Do you see a risk in that then they do almost like an overcorrection where they pretty much ignore, like if a Democrat's like, well, I've got California in the bag, forget California, and then I'm going to spend all my time focusing on these three other states.
I'm not one who thinks that red states stay red and blue states stay blue. I think that there are periods of time where there is a stretch, and that might happen, but if you look at California, as recently as 1988, you guys voted for George H.W. Bush. That wasn't that long ago, really. And you can look at if you look at the whole history of states voting, what you really see are states that, well, let me back up. I also don't buy the idea that only swing states matter. Safe states are important. Like you just said, no Democrat wants to go in the election without California in its back pocket. So what do they do to make California happy? It has to do with the governance. It has to do with the laws that are, California is happy and blue because it's happy with what Democrats have been doing in office for the 4 years that preceded the election. And when they start to become unhappy, they're going to let people know pretty quickly.
Right. I don't even know that they're happy in this state anymore. I think it's just like, we're blue, we're blue. That's just kind of how it is. And the Republicans here, who I've talked to, some of them are just so defeated. They're like, we're trying so hard. We're watching our state crumble, and high taxes and more homeless people and more drugs on the streets and all this stuff. But they're just kind of throwing their hands up like, we've just lost so many times in a row now.
I always wonder what would happen if people just voted without regard to how they felt about it. For every state. Like, what if all the Democrats came out in Texas? It didn't assume that they were going to lose, that they just came out. What if all the Republicans came out in California? It didn't assume they were going to lose, just came out.
Just came out,
see what would happen. But also, if you look historically, you can find lots of examples of states that just changed unexpectedly. Or they threatened to change, and the parties reacted. Utah in 2016 was threatening to vote third party. Okay, so they were just unhappy. They're ready. And Mike Pence was dispatched to the state to make things right because Republican Party did not want to lose its small, safe little red state of Utah. In 2000, West Virginia flipped. They flipped because they became really unhappy with the environmental policies of the Democratic Party. And they swung the election. We all focus on Florida, but without West Virginia, there was no way that George W. Bush was going to win that election. So a safe, small state flipped and changed everything. And you can look through history and you can see states changing their allegiance, back and forth over time. So I tend to say, look, the safe states matter. They made up their minds earlier in the process based upon the governance that came before. And swing states are just late to make up their minds.
Yeah.
They're indecisive. But everybody's important. You can't get to 270 without some combination of safe and swing states. You simply can't get there. So you got to do something to get them on your side.
So I'm not even sure how much rebuttal this one even needs. I mean, she essentially didn't really answer the question. She essentially just pointed out and explained how swing states work. And she's right. Yeah. States have changed from election to election. Different states become swing states. And sure, changing policy changes some states to make them, less safe than they used to be, and sometimes even flipping safe states to swing states. But how does this address the question that Dave actually asked at the top of this, right? So the system that we have now makes certain states swing states. Their vote matters dramatically more than other states. Some states, it could be argued that if you're in the minority, your vote legitimately does not count from election to election, right? That's really the issue he's raising. She's simply saying, oh, well, that minority of people that counts every election changes from election to election. Well, the issue is still that it's a minority of states whose votes actually matter. What she just said does not begin to address that, at all. The fact that that minority is different from time to time doesn't change the fact that it's a minority of people deciding our election every single time we've had an election. I mean, this is just not really much of an answer there.
So is there anything you would do with the way the Electoral College is set up to tweak it, to tighten it or anything? Or do you feel it's basically as perfect a system as we can do in a country of 320 million some odd people?
I like it. When I first started this close to 20 years ago, there were small things I would change. I thought, well, maybe we could automate the elector, so there's no possibility of elector independence. Or maybe we could change the contingent election process, where the president's elected by the House if nobody can get a majority. And I thought maybe we could tweak it. But the more I study it, the more I look, the more I think this is just a really delicate balance. And if you change one thing, you don't know what kind of domino effect that might have. And so I would just leave everything. I think and it may not be perfect, but it's the best we're going to do in an imperfect world. I steal something Winston Churchill said sometimes, and he said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have tried. So I say the Electoral College is the worst possible form of presidential election, except for all the others that have been tried.
Right.
It's the best we can do in an imperfect world, and it's got a lot of benefits.
So this is a slight deviation from Electoral College specifically, but what do you think of sort of the state of people believing that the system itself works, that the election process works and is untampered with, and Russians and hacking and all of these things, and just fraud in general? Because it seems to me that no matter what happens in the next election, half the country is going to claim that it was illegitimate, and we're seeing this even now. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, now that Hillary's sort of reappearing, she's basically calling Trump an illegitimate president because she did win the popular vote, as we talked about. Right. So it's like, it seems to me that that again comes to the optics part of it, where it's like we're setting up something where half the country, no matter what, every 4 years is going to think that something illegal or immoral or awful has happened.
Well, this is what I would observe. There's no such thing as perfection. There will always be people that want to cheat. There will always be people that will look for a way to steal an election if they can. I can't fix that. Nobody can fix that. The Electoral College can't fix that. But what we can do is we can make it as hard as possible. We can throw up as many hurdles as we possibly can. And if you have a national popular vote system, then what you have is one centralized national database that, or just voting system tabulation, whatever. You just have to hack one thing. Okay? You have to, and that means, by the way, also that you have to be on defense in every single precinct of the country. So you can be in the bluest blue California precinct, and if votes are stolen there, you affect everybody. Or the reddest red Texas precinct, that vote affects everybody. Right now we have a situation where you don't have to be on defense absolutely everywhere. You just have to be on defense in a few danger spots, which means you can focus all of your resources there, and that's better. Also, by the way, if you're talking about hacking, it's not just hacking one national tally. You have to actually hack multiple tallies around the country, because there are 51 different election systems, 50 plus DC election systems. So you'd have to identify which one would be, the most relevant, which state's going to be close, which state could swing this, can I hack it? And you have to be able to have all of these things working for you before you can actually steal an election. Is it impossible? Probably not. I'm not going to claim that. But you can make it as hard as possible and make it so that they have to get through as many hoops as possible before they can influence you.
Right. So as somebody that obviously you like states' rights, and you're trying to set up a system the way it was originally set to be, which is that you're trying not to give too much power to the federal government, would you leave the voting mechanisms to the states, or should we have a federally mandated system of voting? Because right now it's like we got hanging chads in one state, and we got electronic voting in another state. Some states have receipts after the electronic voting, some states don't, and a zillion other punch cards and a gajillion different things, which that in and of itself seems really messy.
I think one of the most important things that people don't appreciate or know about the Electoral College is how important it is to protect its state's prerogative just to choose to run its own election, choose its own electors, and to be in charge of itself. And maybe the best way to demonstrate that is to show what would happen on the opposite side. If we did have one national tally, well, what that means is a national election code, a national bureaucracy, a new presidential appointees to run this whole thing that you've put in place. And so now you've got potentially an incumbent president in charge of his own election because he's in charge of the federal machinery that will make it happen. But how it is now, every state makes its own decisions. Some states will make better decisions than others. It's like the laboratories of democracy kind of idea. They'll see what works, what doesn't work. They'll change. But everybody will be in charge of themselves, and that by itself is a protection. If
we want to isolate one clip, and next time somebody says to me, Dave, why do you think the Electoral College is good? Can you give me like the sort of bumper sticker video that we can use to just push out to people in a couple of minutes, like the cleanest, clearest reasoning for the Electoral College?
I just always say it makes presidential candidates reach out to a wide variety of voters. Given how big and diverse our country is, it's important. The founders thought that 13 states was too large and too diverse to have anything else. Well, we're so much bigger right now. And so people say it's outdated, and I say the opposite. It's more important now. How can we expect such a diverse country to govern itself if we don't have? This is the only person expected to represent all of us. The only one. There are senators that represent states, or congressmen that represent districts. Everybody else represents a smaller subset of people. The president must elect the most liberal person, or represent the most liberal people in California and the most conservative people in, Mississippi or something. So it's just, you got to have a special system in place for that to make him or her take into consideration as many people as possible.
I think I know your answer to this one, but would you say that our founding documents are basically the greatest man-written documents?
I think so.